Hello, my name is Dr. Rosalind Jones. I'm the MBA Director of the suite of programmes, and it's an absolute pleasure to see you today. Today, I thought I'd come and talk to you about change management, but specifically with regard to disaster recovery and crisis recovery, and how we manage through change. And then following that, with Julie, we're going to have a Q&A, and I'll be joining you in person. So part of our resilience strategy today is to pre-record this just before today, in case any of you have problems accessing it. So this is me, Dr. Rosalind Jones, 13 years business and ops experience in the Department of Work and Pensions. So lots of research post my MBA, and my particular interest is in strategic orientation of firms and companies. And you can see there different sector examples: agriculture, oil, gas and tourism, supply chains and radical new product developments, NPDs, networks, technology and digitization. So quite a broad perspectives. And I thought I'd put a link in here for you for later. I won't click on it now, but if you'd like to have a browse, I'd like to show you one of the big projects that I'm working on in the University of Birmingham, which is quantum technology. And we have a hub in the University of Birmingham, which covers some major industries. And I'm working on some research on how we get very innovative products to market via supply chains. And these are cold atom sensors for different industries, for example, medical science. So it's really interesting. I thought you might want to see that. Some of my other research areas are digital marketing and looking at how companies and entrepreneurs acquire knowledge to actually implement it. It's seen as a panacea for company growth, but actually if you've got a small business, it's very difficult to learn how to do that and to get the return on investment that you need. So that's a bit about me. So today we're talking about disaster recovery responses from a business perspective. And looking at change management, how do firm activities and behaviours constrain or enhance firm survival and growth? And how do organisations recover from environmental disaster and hence economic crisis? So we've heard a lot at the moment, haven't we, in the press about this constant push-pull between dealing with the COVID crisis and economic downturn and the effects on business. So it's a very delicate balance. So I wanted to discuss today something really pertinent for what you're dealing with yourselves in your daily lives, and for the assignment that you're looking at in terms of change and change management. So this session considers the following: a way a firm orientates itself and change management, our ecosystems globally and locally, and the impact of the environmental disaster on organisations, looking at disaster and crises studies literature, which offers new insights into the way businesses can recover, but it's been lacking. So this research I'm talking about today is relatively new and important. I would argue, as a researcher, only through effective, swift adaptation and change can organisations survive, and that's become increasingly important. So I'm now going to talk about firm orientation measures and frameworks as they relate to firm growth. So all the studies we tend to see on firm orientation are mainly interested in what we do to make companies grow. But actually, when we look at survival, we need to look at sustainability and resilience as well. So often firm orientation has been measured quantitatively in large-scale American studies with large companies that operate in mass marketing markets and industries. So they have developed, researchers have developed scales and constructs and measures to measure this. So this gives us some statistics and we can look at relationships, but it doesn't tell us the hows and whys. So Coley and Jaworski, 1990, Coley et al., 1993, are market orientation scholars. And from very large amount and level of research is being carried out, and also in entrepreneurial orientation literature. Knight, 1997, for example, and Matsuno et al., 2002. These are what we would call keystone papers. And what was really interesting when I was looking at these sort of areas myself during my PhD, quite a while ago, in the 2011, firms that adopt a combination of orientations, for example, market and entrepreneurial orientation, do exhibit higher growth. But what's particularly interesting about this is that happens where a market is disrupted. But if you're in a very stable, safe market that's non-competitive, it is less effective. But it does tell us that having these combination of orientations really does help survival. And in the paper that I produced in the 2011, I consider this from a new qualitative behavioural perspective, looking at the way firms' attitudes and behaviours affect firm growth. And this year, I'm delighted to say it won a prize in America, which is quite unusual for UK publications, because it's influenced the field so much in that area. So I like simplistic diagrams. I think that are easy to understand and easy to apply, and I think that's why it's been popular. Here's a basic Venn diagram of what we're looking at. So this is a conceptual model, which means it's taken from looking at other studies on these areas and reflecting on the company that I was actually working with on my PhD, which was a small software company. So here you can see that there are overlaps in EO, entrepreneurial orientation, MO, market orientation, CO, customer orientation, IO, innovation orientation. And one of the things that's different about this study is that I'm making it explicit that there is a big difference between market and customer orientation. Whereas in the American studies, they would always subsume customers with market. But I argue that customer orientation and focus is indeed very different from market orientation. One of the reasons for this is that often smaller companies that I was observing were very customer focused, but they weren't aware of their own market and their competitors, and that put them at a disadvantage. So if you're measuring that as one construct, market orientation, it really doesn't clearly display what's going on. So it's really helpful when you're doing your MBA to understand how to apply concepts and models, and so also to have the assumptions of models. So I remember spending a lot of time trying to look those up in books myself to really help me understand what these models meant. Now, these are explained in the conceptual paper, and the references are at the end of this presentation, but I just thought I'd cover some of the key points. So the reason for this model is that in smaller firms, their orientations and their activities and behaviours are often implicit. Okay, they're not necessarily planned and specific, they just occur naturally, and they're fluid, and there's a lack of departmentalism. And the reason for that is because obviously they're smaller companies. But again, what we can learn from small companies is that larger companies that are bureaucratic and centralised find it very difficult to quickly move because they have different departments where they have to communicate, and that failure can sometimes break down between them. So if we can have a firm that is more entrepreneurial, which we'll be talking about later on, this can make them more adaptive. So the firm focus or orientation depends on the situation at a given time. So firm sustainability or growth can be affected by its pervasive environment, so where it's embedded. Particularly with smaller companies, you can imagine in a locality. Firm orientations are also driven by an entrepreneur's own influence, their own passion, their own drive, their own attitude will actually decide, if you like, the way that the company will go and how it will grow. Firms that adopt EMO, entrepreneurial marketing orientation, are proactive rather than reactive in seeking opportunities. So seeking opportunities is an entrepreneurial trait and really important in terms of survival and sustainability, particularly in terms of disaster. So a question I'd like to posit to you all is, what is the risk when organisational change is reactive? One of the main reasons that proactivity is important is to keep up with the moving market. So the more competitive a market is, the faster it moves, the faster the organisation needs to change to keep up with it. And there's a researcher called George Day in 2000 talks about the marketing capabilities gap. And what this means, this isn't marketing as such, this is where you need to be at that point in the market. And if you don't keep up with it, that by innovation and by entrepreneurial activity, and you have poor marketing sensing capabilities, you lose track and you can't keep up. And we can see examples in that. For example, Nokia phones some years ago really slipped back for some time because they didn't keep up the market and they didn't see competitors coming along with BlackBerry, for example. That's an old example that I hope most of you will remember. But there are newer examples we see where we have a traditional market that does not anticipate the force of technological changes. For example, the way booksellers sell books, and then we have Amazon taking over that market quite often, so that the booksellers have to then adapt for a more experiential feeling for people coming shopping and perhaps having a cafe drink and reading a book. So applying to larger organisations, we would look at this from an entrepreneurial perspective. Entrepreneurship is something less talked about, I think, and it's really important because this explains that perhaps in a larger company you can have entrepreneurial teams and have cross-disciplinary projects and roll out innovative techniques and ways of overcoming issues and barriers. And again, this goes against the thoughts we'd have in sort of bureaucratic centralized organizations, and it provides flexibility. So the following figure depicts an overarching set of dimensions that are observed in each of these orientations. And this again came from the study in 2011 from my PhD some time ago. And you can see here, and the references at the bottom there, you can see under each of the orientations, these are the aspects that I distilled from the literature. And the literature I've used is from studies on other companies to see what they distilled as the main dimensions for each of these orientations, those most frequently mentioned. Okay, so we'll start with entrepreneurial orientation. So there's a focus on research and development, a speed to market, which means getting products out to market as soon as possible, ahead of competitors. Risk taking, which means in this context means not taking radical risk, but being aware that you can control risk and being careful with this. So calculated risks. Proactive behaviours. And then looking at innovation orientation, having this overarching knowledge and infrastructure within the organisation that encourages and stimulates and sustains innovation. And that innovation could be small step change, okay, incremental innovation, or it could be radical, it could be new product developments. And whatever company you're in or organisation, there will be a form of innovation. It depends in what sense this could be. It could be creativity, for example. Customer orientation. Within this are dimensions such as responsiveness towards customers, replying to them very quickly, responding to their needs quickly, being flexible and adaptive, meeting their needs. Very clear communication between customers, close working with customers. Understanding and delivering customer value is really, really important. And this is difficult for companies, but it has to be from the consumer's perspective, their viewpoint. And of course, in some markets where there is such a distinctive market offering, like an innovative product, then you have to work very closely with them to understand what that value is that they need from you. Market orientation is the proactively exploiting markets, making the most of markets, spotting the most lucrative market, having really good implicit intelligence on marketing, and that can be from networks and relationships, and being responsive towards competitors, being aware of what they're launching and moving very quickly towards that. So in whatever context you work, even in public sector, a lot of this will still also apply. One of the things that's very different here in this model is the fact that integration of business processes is included here. whereas previously other researchers have discussed departments working together and how that should be close working. But here, I describe it as integration of business processes, because with technology in businesses, even if a company is large, this should become more fluid, and we need to move away from departmentalism. So an example of using this comes from my study. So I completed my research in Wales because I was at Bangor University, and I looked at small software companies, a small sample, who were in what we call Technium. Technium Cast have been disbanded now, but they were special sites, small sites for incubators to start up. And then I compared this with a colleague and did some research in Silicon Valley on similar sized companies, carrying out the research in exactly the same way. So Dr. Mari Saranta is a good friend and colleague in Finland, and also works in Berkeley, California. And what was really interesting, it really highlighted the ecosystem effect, the impact on orientations, the situation of the firms in those ecosystems, the opportunities offered for those firms in different ecosystems. Of course, I knew it would automatically be very different, Wales, UK to Silicon Valley. They are extreme examples, but what it highlights is in the US, in Silicon Valley, there's a huge focus on entrepreneurial orientation. It is almost aggressive in the pursuit of opportunity and risk. But of course, it's easier to take risk when you have venture capital at your fingertips. And business growth within the first year could often be 3 billion, even though you've got 18 employees. In the UK, there was much greater focus on customer orientation, with a real fear of losing important customers, perhaps public sector customers, the tail wagging the dog with the company being quite small. But also they were risk averse because they found to borrow money to build the business in the UK, it was actually quite expensive. It was cheaper, for example, to mortgage your own house. So actually they were more cautious because they had more to lose. So you can see here in a simple way, in a brief way, how ecosystems impact on companies. I wanted to tell you about firm orientation because it underpins the main model that we're looking at now. Now, this is a very devastating photograph of a series of events of the Canterbury earthquakes in 2011. And from this, over time, we've been studying companies out in Canterbury and how they've successfully recovered. And these are small restaurants, businesses and cafes. And these are really important because, of course, they're part of the community. And I've been doing this work with a lady called Dr. Susie Morrish, very interesting and very moving work. So we're looking at how do organisations recover from disasters or crisis? How do successful firms react? So we're looking at a process over longitudinal research. How are these changes made? What did they do to survive? What do we need to know? So there's very limited research of business and disaster recovery. That's what we found. And again, mainly quantitative, so large scale surveys. So numerically, this will give you data, but it doesn't actually tell you the hows and the wherefores. And so it wouldn't help, particularly on an MBA, if you were to take some of those papers and to look at them. What we need to know is what actually goes on in companies and how do we best make changes to help with survival and sustainability and growth. So Fabian Eggers in 2020 looked at finance, institutional environments, strategy and strategic orientation, and highlighted those 4 areas as actually the areas that people have been researching in terms of business and disaster recovery. And Fabian's work was stimulated by, of course, COVID and the pandemic and resilience. It's been interesting that our paper was published just before COVID had reared its head. So we did it very much in ignorance of that work, but we're focusing on disaster recovery in a different context. So largely, disaster recovery research covers community recovery because, of course, that's important, and resilience research. So that's a societal research, but we don't have much that covers actual economies, if you like, economics and businesses. How do they survive? And in New Zealand, many failed and many were delayed, and only a very small number, and it's mentioned in the paper that you've been given, only a very low percentage actually survived at the very beginning. So this is really huge that the restaurants that we found survived. Of those that successfully recovered, they took certain decisions, and that's what we were really interested in. And looking at this and distilling the data and looking at this through the concept of entrepreneurial marketing has distilled this for us. Okay, and the framework is something that I think you'll find very useful. So this is extracted from our paper in Journal of Business Research, American journal. So if we look at this, because it's a process, take it from the left to the right. So if we look over here, I've got my cursor, and you can see we looked at post-disaster environment and what these entrepreneurs that we interviewed were facing. Okay, so they were facing personal impact. So some people lost family and friends or employees. Then there's their personal impact on their finances. There was a business impact. The businesses were perhaps partially destroyed or completely. And in the central zone, where the earthquake took place, they had to move out from that. And I won't go into too much detail because that's in the paper. Then we look at the next stage, and we looked at what made these entrepreneurs decide to resume their business. And they did this very swiftly. When others delayed, so they waited several months or more, or got out, actually left, and we count that as fail. So what made them resume this business so rapidly? And we went back to the literature and studies of entrepreneurs, and we found that self-efficacy is really important. And again, that's explained in the paper. This knowledge that somehow you have the power to make this work, this self-confidence that you will make things happen, that you will deal with the new normal that comes about from post-disaster. And also we looked at quite new research on effectual reasoning. And Sarasvati is an Indian lady who lives in America, who's amazing and has done some qualitative research on what you know, who you know. And so rather than looking at this from a managerial way, looking at this from a resource way of who do I know to help me get what I need. And that's exactly what these entrepreneurs did. They used local family and friends to help and build their connections to overcome the issues they had to rebuild their businesses. And again, that's in the paper. So then moving on, we looked at the actions that they took and we distilled those from the myriad of information we had, as you can imagine. So these are the main three key areas. So they made a decision and took action to relocate if they needed to. And they looked for financial injection. Now, New Zealand has very good insurance against earthquakes. Now, it's interesting to notice that not all countries have this. If you're a developed country, there should be really good insurance if you're in an earthquake area. But quite often, for example, somewhere like Indonesia, where they recently had a tsunami, they have no insurance. And so people are left with nothing. So recovery, it really is very difficult. So in New Zealand, they did actually get their insurance money for their businesses very quickly from the government. But there still is an awful lot of red tape, and that's reported a lot in disaster studies in America. And one really interesting aspect of this as well is that they actually created new business models. They were enforced to do that by this rapid disaster situation. And they adapted new models to overcome things. So examples would be that they found a new premises, and shared that premises. So they might use the premises for a cafe in the morning, and somebody else might run a bar joint sort of thing in the evening. Other people have pop-up cafes in caravans, containers as well, container shops, the transport containers that we use globally, and adapted those. So all sorts of different ways of doing that. And business model creation can be in the design of your business internally as well, not just actually your physical premises, of course. So then we looked at, through the entrepreneurial marketing lens that I've been describing earlier, we looked at what sort of behaviors they carried out. What was different? How and why was entrepreneurial marketing different in a disaster context? So here we saw that we know that entrepreneurs are really good at leveraging additional resources for firms. We know they do that through this effectual reasoning. But What happened here in this context is you're trying to hang on to your resources. And if you think about that now, that really does reflect on what we're going through now during COVID in large organisations as well. So really good at retaining. So retaining your staff, trying to find new staff, retaining finance, retaining what you have and not losing any further. And I think that's really important. So that's one thing they were all really good at. The other thing they were also doing as well, rather than just calculating risk and perhaps using risk to grow companies, which often happens, they became accepting of risk. So they carried on their business knowing that they had to accept a certain level of risk, and also trying to mitigate for any further risk. And you'll see that now with organisations trying to cope with perhaps a lack of financial income, for example, maybe considering something like redundancy with employees. That would be one example. But being more able to accept this risk, and that's what we saw with this group of entrepreneurs. And that's not an outward facing thing, sometimes is a retraction, as we're seeing with companies now. And then they were also very good at seeking opportunities, spotting opportunities. We see now some companies have really benefited during the crisis by diversification and pivoting perhaps into a new market by offering something different. And these entrepreneurs did this as well, and it's detailed in the paper. You can see that they offered free hot chocolate out to people to keep people going, because they had a lot of rescue workers and builders in rebuilding the city. And so that helped the community. They were altruistic in their behaviour as well. So all sorts of opportunities were created because of this disaster. Also, the most important thing in terms of customer orientation is creating new customer value, and this really held true here. So creating a new concept of value for customers, because what customers needed was different, and being aware of that. Okay, so those 4 areas are interesting because 3 of those are entrepreneurial, and the other one, of course, is customer related. And that's interesting when you look at innovation orientation as well. I've talked about a market orientation. So those were the things that were highlighted. So this is my viewpoint from the paper. Pandemics impact negatively on resilience of ecosystems. Government planning can either support or constrain resilience. So situational factors impact on the country or region's ecosystem. So to differing degrees, ecosystems are impacted during and post-pandemic, but the severity of impact can have such an immediacy that it's much like disasters rather than a crisis, and may require disaster planning. So this is my opinion that I'm offering you now, is that the implication of crisis to me is that it's a gradual thing. And yet in many areas, disaster is more appropriate because we see a sudden shortfall of income stream for some companies that is absolutely immediate. So very worth considering. So I thought today I'd look at how you'd apply this post-disaster recovery framework to your own organisation. So I've given you a little exercise here. Think about the EMO model, which is the Venn diagram which we've gone through already. Think about the post-disaster recovery framework, which is empirical, which I've mentioned earlier. Looking at these models and frameworks, they help us to dig deeper and gain deeper insight into practical issues and generate much more interesting and relevant insights than we would normally if we did, for example, just a report. Using these, I'll take you through the next slide, which shows how I've adapted the framework for larger organisations and post-pandemic situations. So what I've done here is taken that model that's published, and I've adapted it. And this is something I've shown to a couple of audiences, a group of researchers in India who asked me to do this, and also the Singapore students. I've also shown them this, and I've done a little bit more work today just to highlight some of the things that might interest you in terms of explaining change implementation and disaster recovery. So hopefully you'll find it interesting. So strategic change and firm orientation adaptation leading to recovery in entrepreneurial marketing behaviours. And I know from your individual assignment that you've got, because I like to link what I'm saying to what you're doing. Think about this in terms of one of the points there is about behaviours, change behaviours. Some of this might have real relevance, and also how it also might have relevance is for the contextual background to your organisation problem that you're using for your change management coursework. And I think that might be very helpful. So that is to say, obviously you're using change management literature, but you may find some of this other literature helpful in breaking down the processes of what happened and what needs to change or has changed in your proposals within your coursework. Okay, so on the left, we start with business post-disaster environment and ecosystem. So you can think about what happens with your own company, why, or in what ways that impacted. And then moving on to the next stage, we have strategic decision making, which I'm saying here is hopefully entrepreneurial if it's going to resume in some way. Now, it might be some of the things are very managerial, but there might be some entrepreneurial activity as well that you could see. And I'm assuming, but there may be people here that have retraction. So part of your operations, your company may retract and take a cautious approach, which may be very sensible, given the context that you're in. Maybe your company is delaying operations, or maybe it's opted to get out completely. So it's worth looking at what stage your company's at and what it's done. Now, if you're discussing your company, think about it. Perhaps you could define an area. If you're a strategic business unit or you're a council, you can explain how you fit into the wider picture of this in general. That helps. Then the third stage here, during the post-COVID change implementation area, think about reconfiguring things like, for example, these are examples I've highlighted that I think might be useful. Reconfiguring resilient supply chains or channels or routes to market. Those are things that companies have to think about. Compliance with employee safety seems to be a big issue at the moment, obviously because of COVID. Also financial support packages available from the Exchequer, perhaps insurance, availability of insurance, and perhaps new or adapted business models. That may be that you can think of lots of other sort of aspects that are relevant in your particular organisation, be it public sector, not-for-profit, or private sector. And you'll see on the right there, think about these areas: opportunity seeking, accepting risk, resource organising, and also creating new customer, and in this case, stakeholder value. Lots of you will come from larger organisations and have stakeholders, many more than perhaps a new company would have, a small software company, as I was looking at. So consider stakeholder value in this as well. That would also be very important. And I've put a link here which you can click on at some point. It's actually, I picked, my choice was to look at a brewery and a winery, and it was interesting because this was July and I was using this for the Singapore students, and already you click on the link, it shows you that what they were doing, they had reverted from making whiskey in the distillery to creating hand sanitizer, and doing this in a very altruistic way. And I think that's a really good way of demonstrating opportunity seeking behaviours. So making something new in order to survive, but it also meets a demand and it's altruistic for the situation that we're in. But already interesting, if you click on the link, very quickly they've stopped doing that and they're back out to opening up for customers coming to visit them and going down the route that we're familiar with now, opening safe hostelry space for customers that we're getting quite familiar with. So I won't click on it now. It's something for you to look at later, but very interesting and looks a great place to go in the States. So these are the sorts of class questions I thought you might want to go away and look at. we can discuss. So what sort of environment and ecosystem issues impact on your organisation the most? Okay, what strategic orientations were made? Were they entrepreneurial rather than managerial? So managerial tends to be a competency that's very administrative and tends to be formalised. It's not meant to be a negative because we have processes that we need to take, but some may be more entrepreneurial in response to the pandemic. And did your organisation move quickly to adapt, to resume what it was doing, or did it need to retract or delay? And if so, in what way? What changes were implemented to ensure organisational resilience or recovery? So think about the key changes that you're aware of. And looking at those entrepreneurial marketing orientation elements found in the post-recovery framework, opportunity seeking, etc., that I've just gone through, list the ways in which your organisation reorientated itself, refocused their activities. What did they do? So in your view, could organisational recovery or resilience be improved by any further actions? This is where you're critically analysing, aren't you? You're using theory, and then you're looking at your company, as an example, and thinking about what could they have done better. And using frameworks is quite useful. You have something to assess against. Could the way that change was managed and implemented be improved? And if so, how? So in a way, that's a reflective competency, thinking about what we could do, what needs to change. And here I have other questions that are much wider for you to do in your own time, but worth looking at. In your opinion, and looking at the EMO model, which is on slide 10, what orientations pre-pandemic did your organisation mainly focus on? So which way do you think they were orientated? Would you describe your organisation as largely managerial rather than entrepreneurial in their change management approach in its totality? Post-pandemic, would you see this as having shifted? So has it moved in some way? How and why? How has it done that? And then finally, you could critique the post-disaster recovery framework in the context of your own organisation. Slide 14. Does the framework that we've developed itself have any limitations when it's applied to your company or your organisation? How would you adapt or extend this framework when using it in your organisation, in your industry, in your market sector? So feel free to draw your own or take that and what does that look like in the context of your organisation? And this is really good to take a model apart or extend it in some way from what you know, because often what we know in qualitative research is very context specific. And here I've listed all the relevant papers that you might be interested in looking at. And it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. We'll have a Q&A in a minute. And this is what we see as academics going up to graduation. So that will keep you going, looking forward to when you graduate on your MBA programme. And again, emphasising the teaching and research that we do at the University of Birmingham. And it's been a delight to talk to you all. Thank you very much.
Hello, Ros.
Yeah?
Wow, that was absolutely fantastic.
Really?
What great ideas. No, we're still recording, are we?
Probably. How do I stop?
Don't worry. No, I just wanted to say thank you for doing that. Absolutely brilliant.
Sorry, I can't stop recording it. 1 minute. I can't stop recording it. Oh, okay. There we are. Got it.